change the way I do it. But all right, so let's talk about pharmacology. When we think about pharmacology, the way that I like to the beginnings of what we are talking about here is cause and effect. And what Dr. Keel is trying to teach you guys for this first exam is the broadest fundamentals of how drugs interact with the body. You will learn in MedChem those specific interactions, and you'll learn in Thera how we utilize those interactions and provide treatment. But it's in pharmacology that we actually learn the ways in which a drug manifests its ability. So in a sense, we're figuring out what the drug is and what the effect of the drug can be. Now, that can either be the anticipated effect. So if I give a blood pressure drug, obviously I want it to lower blood pressure, but it could also be a side effect. So it could be something like it causes someone to get really dizzy, or it could cause someone to have explosive diarrhea. So we always have some sort of cause and effect relationship between drugs in the body. Where I want to start off talking about is probably with the more confusing aspect of the first exam, and that's talking about the different kinds of receptors. So broadly, we have a bunch of different kinds of targets for drugs. Why aren't you? Why aren't you writing? Man, I really thought this was okay. There we go. Man, you think I'd know what I'm doing by this point? 7 years in. All right. So when we look at drug targets, obviously we are going to learn a lot more than what we are starting with, but what we have to understand is the different ways in which a cell interacts with its surroundings. So the first thing that can be is it can be an ion channel. And the second aspect is that it can be a receptor. So there are a ton of different kinds of receptors out there. And we can classify them based on the way that they act. So for example, in terms of the ion channels, we can classify by their gating, which in a sense is just talking about how they the mechanism by which they open. And really, there's two big ones that we are going to focus on, and that would be voltage gated and ligand gated. And I think people go back and forth between ligand and ligand, but I'm pretty sure it's ligand. You will also hear this often referred to as neurotransmitter, but drugs can also be a ligand, but they're not necessarily neurotransmitters. We'll talk more about the difference between these two in a second, but the other thing that we can classify ion channels by is by their ions. And you guys remember from biochem when we talk about the action potential that we can have potassium ion channels, we can have sodium ion channels, calcium ion channels. There are chloride, proton, tons and tons and tons of stuff. And then, of course, too, you have your non-selective. So these would be ones that are like your co-channels. So they allow the flow of sodium and potassium, maybe sodium and calcium, whatever it might be. The last portion of this is the location that we find them. So we can either be a plasma membrane channel, or we can be some sort of intracellular component. And what this essentially means is that this could be something that's on the endoplasmic reticulum. It could be possibly on the Golgi body. Maybe it's on the nucleus itself. But in what we are essentially trying to separate out is something that is affecting the entire cell as a whole, meaning it's on the plasma membrane, or something that is affecting an organelle or a localized area of the cell. Any questions about these sorts of stuff? Does this kind of clarify what was talked about in class?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. All right. If at any point you guys are like, this doesn't help me at all, let me know, as always. In terms of receptors, we have GP GPCRs, which you guys know that we have three kinds. We have GA, GI, and GQ. And we'll break down, oh, GS, my bad, not A. And then we're going to break down specifically what the difference between GS and GQ is. Because you learned that they're both stimulatory, but in two very different ways, because we know that there are two different pathways. We also have we also have the tyrosine kinase receptors, the TKRs, which you're required to know about for the exam, for the first exam, but you won't really talk about them until much, much later in the semester. So we're not going to focus a whole bunch on them just because they're not too important right now. We also have steroid receptors. And then the last thing that I put here, but I think could be technically separated into its own category, are pumps and transporters. And we've learned about tons and tons of different kinds of transporters. Probably the biggest one is the sodium potassium ATPase, or there's also the proton pump that's part of the the cascade chain. I can't remember the name that you guys learned about last year. let's dive in and talk about the GPCRs, because those are probably the place where people are most confused, and then we'll talk about this other stuff. When we look at the G protein coupled receptors, what's important to understand is that they all have the same basic structure, but what comes after their activation is what differentiates them. All GPCRs are six transmembrane units. Is that the yes? Seven, right? Am I crazy? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, seven. Um, seven transmembrane units. And the way that the way that I understood it is when you have your GPCR is like a little squiggly line, and on the inside of the receptor you have three subunits. You have the alpha subunit, and then you have the beta gamma subunit. For all intents and purposes, the beta and gamma subunit are not important. They're important in terms of cancer and metastasis and stuff like that. But in terms of where we are right now, we're not going to focus on it too much. But it's this alpha subunit that really allows for GPCRs to have multiple different kinds of interactions. The three kinds of alpha subunits that exist are GS, GI, and GQ. So the way to kind of think about this is that they're all vanilla ice cream, but one of them is vanilla gelato, one of them is vanilla soft serve, and another one's vanilla, hard ice cream. They all taste the same, but they're all going to have slightly different effects in the body. Does that make sense? Kind of. So the way to think about this is that when you have an agonist, so when a ligand binds, it causes the alpha subunit to detach from the beta and gamma and cause the effect of the kind of flavor we have. So the agonist binds. Our beta and our gamma subunit fly off by themselves and leave us with just the alpha. When we list the three different effects based on the kind of flavors we have, GS is, as we know, stimulatory. GI is inhibitory. And GQ, does anyone know what the Q stands for? Queer. I'm not joking. I'm pretty sure that's what the Q stands for. But what I'm going to have you guys associate it with is muscle. Because where we find GQ is around muscle, specifically smooth muscle. And we'll talk about that connection in a second. When we look at the cause, is always ligand binding, right? The cause creates the effect. So if you have an agonist at GS, you are stimulatory. If you have an agonist at GI, you are inhibitory. But let's compare and contrast this with a antagonist. A ligand binds, but it's an antagonist. For GS, what could the effect be? How could we phrase this? Well, we're going to prevent stimulation. Now, this can be interpreted as being inhibitory. Except, are we actually causing inhibition? No. The cause is we're preventing stimulation. We're preventing a agonist from binding to GS that would cause stimulation, which mimics inhibition. Same thing if we have a antagonist bind to a GI cell. If we prevent inhibition, then this appears to be stimulating. Are we actually stimulating the cell? No, we're just preventing inhibition. So it's a double negative, essentially. This is a really, really important distinction because on the exam, he'll ask questions like, you have an antagonist at a GI receptor. Would this increase the action of the cell, decrease the action of the cell? No effect? So really understanding the implications of cause and effect is big for receptors. Does this make sense? Kind of, sort of? Yes. Any questions? Wait, why is it preventing it from stimulating again? Great question. The effect of the antagonist is to block activation. So when an agonist binds to a receptor, it activates that receptor and the receptor does its job. Oh, okay. All right. All right. So let's look at GS and GI because they are great question. So if we have an antagonist at GI, will it stimulate? That is what the effect looks like. So let's write this out. We have an antagonist at GI. So here's our cause. What will our effect be? The correct way to interpret this scenario is to say that it prevents stimulation. Prevents inhibition. On the exam, what you're going to end up having is 4 choices, and the choices are going to be something like the action of the cell will increase, the action of the cell will decrease, no effect, It depends. So what do we think the correct answer will be here? I would say A as well. Why? Because the effect appears to be stimulating. Now, what if you had another question where it said, is an antagonist at GI, this is stimulating, inhibitory, appears to be stimulating, appears to be inhibitory. So you have an antagonist at GI. What will exactly? So it appears to be stimulating. It is not stimulating the cell. It's preventing inhibition. So it's a very, very fine distinction, but Keel is known for these sorts of language questions. And it's important because, the effect of an antagonist can be much smaller than the effect of an agonist. No problem. Any other questions about this idea of receptors? All right. So let's look at the GS mechanism. Just to make it clear what we're looking at, I'm just going to put S. But just be aware that this is, you shouldn't be lazy. Put GS. So once again, when we look at the steps of what is going on in the cell, in order to activate the GPCR, what first needs to happen is our agonist or our ligand to bind. So a ligand binds to the receptor and activates it. So for whatever reason, that ligand has the correct corresponding structure to interact with the active site of the receptor to induce a change, which ends up causing the alpha subunit to detach from the beta gamma subunit. And this is alpha. So step one, the ligand binds. Step two, alpha detaches from beta gamma. And this is the same for all the GPCRs. There's no difference at this stage. For alpha specifically, alpha will then Where did my reference go? There we go. The alpha subunit will now find a enzyme called adenylate cyclase. So once the alpha subunit is released, it goes and finds adenylate cyclase and will activate it. The effect of adenylate cyclase is to convert ATP into cyclic AMP. We're running out of colors. The way to phrase this step is that we have increased the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP. So we didn't just turn on cyclic AMP production. This stuff has to exist somewhere in the cell already. It doesn't just, it's not 0 and then it becomes 100. But what the effect of the GS is that we ramp up the rate of production. So instead of it taking a second to produce a CAMP molecule, now it takes half a second. So it's much faster, and we know that this is the effect of having a substrate on an enzyme, is that it can induce the action of the enzyme to be much better, to help the fit of the ligand. Once CAMP is created, CAMP's job is to find another factory called protein kinase A. Better known as PKA. PKA's job is to take inactive proteins and turn them into phosphorylated active proteins. And you guys should remember from biochem that whenever you see kinase, kinase means phosphorylation. So CAMP is able to come in, and just like the alpha subunit, it increases the action of protein kinase A. So increasing the conversion of ATP to CAMP will increase the action of protein kinase A. Now that we've created these phosphorylated proteins, which you can think of as active proteins, these guys will go off and perform the action of the cell. So maybe it's a pancreatic cell and now it's going to start making insulin. Maybe it's a goblet cell and it's going to start creating hydrochloric acid, or maybe it's going to start creating mucus. Whatever it could be. Whatever the action of the cell is, will happen at this stage. Action of cell. Increases. Any questions about this business? All right. By contrast, is this helpful, by the way, to go through this? Okay. If it's just repetition of class and it's not, let me know. By contrast, if we have a GI receptor where we have the the alpha I subunit, what this is going to do is that it needs to be activated by a ligand. So once again, an agonist has to bind to GI to cause the alpha subunit to detach. And what GI is going to do is it will come in and turn off adenylate cyclase. So if you turn off adenylate cyclase, you do not make CAMP, which means it does not turn on protein kinase A, which means that you do not activate proteins, which means that you do not perform the action of the cell. Any questions about GS and GI? All right. Let's ask some questions then, since you all think you're so clever. Does GS increase or decrease the concentration of CAMP when activated? Increase? Are we sure? Are we absolutely sure? Are you still sure? Yes, it does increase CAMP. Yes. The way that we talk about, aren't you guys glad to be back? The way that we talk about these second messengers is always in terms of concentrations. So if thinking about things in terms of concentrations is confusing, the way to think about them in your head is just number of molecules. And so the way to rephrase this question is, does GS increase or decrease the number of CAMP molecules? It increases the number. Does GS increase or decrease the action of adenylate cyclase? Also increase, right? Again, what would be the effect of GS? It's going to stimulate the action of adenylate cyclase, which is going to cause the conversion of ATP to CAMP. All right. Does it increase or decrease the concentration of ATP? I would agree. Decreased, right? And so if you're going to shunt more molecules through adenylate cyclase, you're going to lower what's on this side. Does anybody remember what the principle from Gen Chem was? We talk about this balancing of sides of. Nobody remembers? Le Chatelier's principle. Hey, the chem
Oh,
nerds.
Garofalo taught it. You expect me to
Yes.
remember?
Fair point.
You saw his notes.
Yeah, fair. Increase or decrease of ah, okay. For GI, does GI increase or decrease the action of the cell? I would agree. Decrease, right? Because it's inhibitory. An antagonist at GS will increase or decrease the concentration of cyclic AMP. I would say decrease. Did he talk about phosphodiesterase, PDE? Probably not. We didn't. Okay. The way to think about this is that, again, we're looking at this is the difference between the effect and the overall what we see happening, right? So if you antagonize GS, you're not going to increase the concentration, but there are mechanisms that will kill off whatever CAMP production is available. Remember how I talked about how CAMP isn't suddenly 0 and then 100. It's already on. But if you turn off the mechanism, the production, eventually that's just going to fall off and you start killing off your CAMP. So just like how we talked about up above, even though the language here is a little bit specific, what we see happening is the opposite. Does that make sense? So if you have an antagonist, for most questions, you can talk about the opposite. And we talked about situations in which we can't. An antagonist at GS will increase or decrease the action of protein kinase A. I would agree. It would decrease it, right? Again, the only thing that is stimulating the production of protein kinase A is CAMP. So if you're inhibiting something upstream, you're going to prevent everything downstream as well. Any questions about this? Okay. These are the kinds of manipulation questions that will be on the exam, talking about agonist, antagonist, all these sorts of different things. I know. The tricky. What uh I think what I ended up doing when I studied for this is I made a table and I talked about, I had things like ATP, camp, uh, adenylate cyclase, and then I compared and contrasted, so in ATP, the concentration goes down, but in GI, the concentration would go up. So if that's a helpful way of kind of framing what goes on, this really helped me to get it in my brain. Different stuff like that. All right. Let us go on to GQ. Just GS and GI because they're opposites of each other. Yes. Yep. Yep. One for an agonist, one for an antagonist. Yeah. All right. G queer. It was a different time when they found these things. Although I think we say queer now. Is it? I should probably know, shouldn't I? Once again, we still have the same first two steps. So a ligand binds and activates GQ. That's going to induce a change in the structure of the membrane, the receptor in the membrane, which is going to cause alpha to separate from beta and gamma. Now, unlike GS or GI, we are not dealing with the we are not dealing with adenylate cyclase. What ends up happening with GQ, I just want to pull up my reference. Is that GQ activates a receptor, not a receptor, a enzyme on the internal side of the membrane called phospholipase C. Who remembers from biochem what a lipase does?
Cuts fatty acids or something along those lines.
Yeah, so it takes some sort of lipid and it breaks it apart. What phospholipase C does is that it takes a molecule that is inside the membrane called PIP2. Am I crazy? PIP2. Yeah. Thank you. PIP2. And it breaks down PIP2 into two products, IP3 and DAG. Where did my reference go? There we go. The first thing to talk about with here, and I think really what is more important for GQ receptors is IP3. IP3 goes to a calcium channel on the endoplasmic reticulum. If you can't remember from 6th grade biology what the ER does, it is a big storage center. So it's essentially a way for the body to hold on to large amounts of substances so that way they can cause big changes and big fluxes in the cell. IP3 goes over to a calcium channel and allows for calcium to flow out of the endoplasmic reticulum and into the intracellular space, into the cytoplasm. This is going to have two big effects. The first thing that's going to happen is that you have calcium flowing out into out of the cell. And if you guys remember from biochemistry, one of the big events that happens with muscle contractions is calcium efflux, or calcium leaving the cell. And so this is why GQ receptors are associated with muscle movement, is because they are involved in the calcium release. Does that make sense? So we didn't specifically point it out back in biochemistry, but the receptor that makes this all possible is GQ for the most part. Skeletal muscle is a little bit different. But smooth muscle, this is essentially how it goes on. So the two effects of IP3, and I kind of forgot to do our steps are, but the first effect is that we have calcium efflux from the cell. And the second effect has to do with what DAG was doing. So while IP3 was going and activating this channel, DAG went ahead and started to turn on a receptor called protein kinase C. It is protein kinase C plus calcium that sustains the muscle contraction. So if you remember from the mechanism of how a muscle movement happens, first you need some calcium efflux, in order for the myopsin head to connect, and the whole thing I barely remember. But the other part of this too is that you need the internal workings of the cell to be modified, and that happens through PKC and calcium. Any questions about this? All right. Couple of questions for you. The calcium channel is a ligand gated, voltage gated, IP3 gated, or GQ gated receptor or channel. I shouldn't say ligand. My bad. Let me. I'll keep it, but I'll explain why in a second. I already put it there. ARC, I think that's fair. He wouldn't do this on the exam. He would take off ligand gated. But we know that this is a ligand because what's causing the opening of the channel is a molecule, and molecules are ligands. We can describe this kind of gate or this ligand by just saying IP3 gated. So really, I shouldn't have put this here because the more correct answer is IP3. Why isn't it GQ gated?
GQ isn't directly activating the release of calcium out of the channel.
Yeah, GQ is not associating with the channel. It's not binding to the channel. It's not interacting with the channel. It's too general, right? It's upstream. We could say it's GQ associated, but it's definitely not the gate that's opening it. Which channel or enzyme is GQ gated? Which channel or enzyme is GQ gated? I would agree. Oop, PKC maybe, or PLC. I would say PLC, right? Because what is the alpha subunit doing? It's first going to phospholipase C, which is going to convert PIP2 to DAG and IP3. We can say that PKC is DAG gated, but it's not GQ gated. The All right. Any questions about these three mechanisms? We're all good? Okay. Oh, question. Hit me with your question.
In the chat.
GQ gated is a thing. It wouldn't be phrased that way. but it's the way to it's not the correct terminology, but it is the way of talking about the association between them. So when we talk about he'd say what is the ligand of phospholipase C? And so the ligand would be the alpha subunit of GQ. All right. So that was probably like an hour worth of class, considering how slow he goes. All right. You said he stopped at 18. Okay. So another concept that really confused me for the first exam was talking about the different kinds of ligands. Now, we already talked about two of them, right? We have a full agonist versus a antagonist. Since you were speaking of biochem, oh yeah, I'd love to hear. There are other kinds of ligands that can happen though. We can have a partial agonist and we can have an inverse agonist. What we are talking about here is once again, the idea of cause and effect. For a full agonist, we expect to see a big increase in the activity of the receptor. Why did I phrase it this way? Is because, again, we talked about how if you have an agonist at GS, that is much different than an agonist at GI. So just because you have an agonist doesn't mean you create things. It just means that we are causing the effect of the receptor. So if you have GS on a saliva cell, a salivary cell, then maybe you cause saliva to be produced, versus if you have an agonist at GI on the same cell, maybe you prevent it. We talked about how an antagonist will stop activity of the receptor. A partial agonist is essentially where that perhaps instead of binding 100% or binding tightly or binding to 100% of all the receptors in the body, maybe it only binds to 75% of the receptors, Or maybe it can only bind for 10 seconds at a time, and then it pops off for a minute. What that means is that we have a smaller increase in the activity of the receptor. Conversely, an inverse agonist will decrease the activity of the receptor. So remember, an antagonist prevents activation. An inverse agonist is going to purposefully cause the opposite. So what are examples of inverse agonists? Well, these would be things that either are, for example, they're hyperpolarizing a cell. So maybe they're binding to a neuron to prevent it from firing. Or maybe they're binding to a receptor to prevent a agonist from binding as well, I guess is a way of talking about it. For example, if you've heard of the drug naloxone or Narcan, that is an inverse agonist. So it's going to induce the opposite of what an opiate does, which is why it's so powerful in terms of reversing the effect. Also with affinity, and we'll talk about that in a second.
So what's the difference between an antagonist and an inverse agonist?
Great question. And for that, we're going to look at the graph. Oops. So this graph in class, I didn't get it the first time I looked at it. Truthfully, every other time I look at it, I still kind of give it a look. But essentially what this is talking about is it's really focusing on this idea of level of response. The way that I want you to think about this is, imagine this is depression. Or relieving depression. So up at the top, we are happy. We're an antidepressant. If we have no response, then we're still depressed. But if we have the opposite response, maybe we are, I don't know, what's the opposite of depressed? Or what's even more depressed than depressed? Maybe we'll say if we have, yeah, we have sad and we have depressed. We'll put it that way. So an agonist is going to have a full effect. So maybe what this drug does, the full effect is that we completely get rid of all this sadness and we have happiness. A partial agonist is going to activate the receptor, and the cause is a partial response. So instead of being the most happy you've ever been, you're kind of, I feel better. The difference is that an antagonist is going to prevent a rise in the response. So in other words, it's completely neutral. It's not inducing, it's not causing us to be depressed, but it's not, it's also preventing happiness. Now, if you prevent happiness, that's the same thing as saying causing sadness, which is where we get that idea of cause and effect, right? Prevent one thing, you cause the opposite in a way. It gets very finicky. An inverse agonist is going to cause the opposite activity of the receptor. It's inducing the opposite effect. So maybe at GS, it causes, we induce inhibition. So instead of a neutral agonist being 0, it's -10. It's -100. It's a huge response. Does that make sense? Okay, sweet, 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 sweet. When we talk about ligand binding, has he talked about affinity yet? Kind of, sort of? Okay, then I think we're diving into new stuff. One of the big concepts in pharmacy is the idea of affinity. Affinity is the how tightly a ligand binds to its receptor. So when we have a receptor and we have our drug, we can have two different states. We can have them when they're dissociated from each other. So in other words, we have two objects, or we can have them when they are associated with each other. And we have one object. In which of the two states are we going to have an effect? Is it going to be on the left side or the right side? I think you guys are mirrored to me, but to the right, right? Because it's on this side that we have the drug gives its action. So our opiate is bound to the receptor. Our proton pump inhibitor is preventing acid. You know, this is binding to whatever receptor is going on, and we are causing the effect. We call this, when the receptor and the drug are combining, we call this the rate of association, Ka. And when we have the drug and the receptor separating from each other, we call it the rate of dissociation, Kd. Which do you think is more important for us to look at? The association rate or the dissociation rate? Because of the stupid units. Yes, it is Kd, but the reason is because we want to prevent dissociation. Drugs and receptors touch each other all the time, but we want them to always touch. We never want them to leave. We want a toxic relationship between them. So we want them to be as close to each other as possible. So that means that we want to have the lowest dissociation possible. Drugs will always go and touch everything. They touch every receptor in the body and they touch it and they leave. But we want it to go to the receptor we want, touch it, and never let go. So we don't care about how fast they associate. We care about what rate do they separate. And so what we measure this with is with KD, and we want the smallest possible number. Has he talked about KD yet? Maybe, kind of. He has. Okay. Where we have we measured things in terms of molar, M, and we have micromolar, UM, K8, what? KHDBDCM?
Like the kilo, the H thing, deca, whatever, like centimeter, like centi.
Oh,
That's what I meant. Sorry.
yes. Okay, now I understand what you're talking about. I had never heard of that before. But yes. Um, uh, this is what I want. No. Yes. Okay. So when we talk about the dissociation rate, what we look at is in terms of the smallest possible number, and this is where people struggle with this, and I totally get it. The smaller numbers are always better in terms of affinity. So if you have a low KD, this means that you dissociate slowly, which means that you have a high affinity. Or in other words, you bind very, very tightly. King Henry died by drinking chocolate milk. Moo. I like that. Really, for all intents and purposes, really the ones that you have to worry about are kilomolar, kilomolar, millimolar, nanomolar, no, micro, nano, and picomolar. So kilomolar is is larger than millimolar, which is larger than micro, and so on. Each time you skip one is 1,000. So you either divide by 1,000 going down, multiply by 1,000 going down, or you divide going upwards. In other words, if the way that I learned it is that 15 kilomolar is how many millimolar? Well, I'm going down, so I multiply by 1,000. So this would be 15,000. Right. If you need to go upwards, you divide by 1,000. So let's compare some drugs. If you have a bunch of drugs, and I asked you which one has the highest affinity for the receptor, so let's say we have 10 kilomolar, 10,000, 15,000 millimolar, 35,000 nanomolar, or 7 picomolar, what would it be? I would go with D as well. How did we get this? Is we want to go for the smallest possible number. So kilomolar is going to be larger than picomolar. So right off the bat, kilomolar is going to be 1,000 times 1,000 times, so 10 to the 9th bigger. Huge, 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 huge. Same thing with millimolar. If I wanted to compare A and B, which has higher affinity, A or B? I would say A, barely. Yeah. The reason for this is because we have 10 kilomolar versus 15 kilomolar. Which is smaller, 10 or 15? 10. So if we wanted to rank these, we can say that A beats B. Which is bigger, B or C? Or which is smaller, I should say. It would be C, because we can go up from nano to nano is smaller than millimolar. So C is here, and then we said D. I feel like I butchered this explanation, but hopefully this makes sense. We're comparing numbers here. Has he talked about Emax and the dose response curve? Okay. I think that's probably the new thing. When we look at a drug, so this would be page 20. Page 20 in his handout. When we look at how a drug is dosed, so for example, in a phase 1, or phase 2, I should say, when they're trying to figure out what dose they need to give a human in order to have the desired response. So someone name a drug. What's your favorite drug?
Phenytoin.
Phenytoin. for seizure prophylaxis or
Yes.
yes? Okay. So what we are measuring here with phenytoin is what dose is required to prevent a seizure. So our cause here is phenytoin binds to the receptor and the response, or in other words, the effect, is we prevent the seizure. So on this dose response curve, what we see here is that we try out a bunch of different doses. So first we give 0 milligrams, and of course we have a response of 0. We give 0.01 milligrams, still no effect. Then we give 0.05, still no effect. But by 0.1 milligrams, we have an effect of 8%. So 8% of the receptors are showing the given response, which would mean that of all the receptors in the body, 8% of them are going to prevent a seizure. I'm abstracting very, very largely here, but this is kind of a way to think about it. Eventually, we start increasing the amount of drug, and we see that by the time that we get to 50 milligrams, we have 100% of the response. So what that means is that somewhere between 10 milligrams and 50 milligrams is the sweet spot dose for how we get the desired response. So if you ever have a drug and it has really, really weird dosing, like aspirin, for example, 325 milligrams, how did they come up with that? Short answer is they didn't. They just measured the weight of a barley grain, and that's what they came up with. But later on, they figured it out, and this is the kind of way that a dose is chosen.
Why do you know that?
I wrote about it in my blog.
You have a blog?
Yeah, I'll show you guys after.
I'm interested.
We call this response Emax. And essentially what this is telling us is where at what dose do we have the maximum effect or the maximum response of the drug. At 50%, we can say that we have the half max response. And for this drug, in order to get to the ED50, that's kind of hard to see. We need to use 1 milligram. What would be the the purpose of knowing when we have 50% of the response versus the maximum response? What can we kind of think about in how we use drugs? Yeah, calculate it. It also gives us an idea of what a minimum dose could be. So a minimum potential dose is 1 milligram, and we know that anything above 50 milligrams is not warranted. Maybe you're pushing into toxicity or side effects, but you're not going to get any more response out of the person or out of the receptor. Does that make sense? So it kind of gives us a lower bound and an upper bound is a way to think about it. Now, obviously, we always want to have patients on, the maximal response, but in a lot of ways, we can use the ED50 to have an idea of where we are. Does this make sense? Okay. Let's look at the next graph. Nope. There we go. Free drugs. So once again, we're looking at the cause and the effect. So, here's 3 different drugs trying to prevent seizures. And what we can do is we can compare the Emax and the ED50 of these drugs. So for drug A, which is the circles, the Emax yes, yep, it'll go up on Google Classroom. Have a good night. Bye. For drug A, our Emax is 100%. So all of the receptors are affected, all of the receptors are responding. For drug B, same thing. Emax is 100%. But for drug C, we can see that the maximum effect of the drug is only 40%. When we compare Emax, we are comparing efficacy. When you compare Emax, you are comparing efficacy. This is important because if you had to choose one drug to not use to prevent seizures, we know which one we're not going to choose, right? 40% of the receptors are going to respond at no matter what dose you give. When we compare the ED50, so the ED50 of A is 50% is 1 milligram. The ED50 of B is 0.1 milligrams. And the ED50 of green is we look at what's the minimum response, which is 0. The maximum response is 40. So we find the middle point between 0 and 40, which is 20, and we see that it is also 0.1 milligrams. What we are talking about here is potency. Efficacy tells us the maximal response. Potency tells us the dose of the drug to produce a standard amount of response, so 50%. On the exam, you're going to get a graph that's like this. And they're going to ask a question like, which drug is the most effective and potent? And so what do we think? Is it A, B, or C? Yeah, it would be B, right? Because what is the most effective, A or B? Which is the most potent? Just B. So smaller doses to produce the same effect means you are way more potent. We see this a lot with opiates, right? You only need 0.001 micrograms of fentanyl to induce a coma versus 100 milligrams of methadone, something like that. Another question that you could be asked is, which drug is a full agonist of the receptor? I would agree, A or B. Why? Because they have 100% response. Which is a partial agonist. Very nice. See. Yeah. So you can pull a lot of data out of this information here. Now, one thing that this does not tell us is affinity, right? This does not tell us which drug has higher affinity. All it tells us is that we have an effect and that we have potency. But in terms of affinity, we don't know that because maybe we need very, very high concentrations of drug B in the body to get this highly effective, highly potent dose. So maybe we need no, we can say that. Yeah. So maybe we need to, even though we need lower doses, maybe it needs to have very high frequencies. So maybe we have to give it 4 times a day. You know, this doesn't tell us anything about affinity. So on the exam, if you're given a graph like this and he asks which drug has the highest affinity, the answer would be not enough information available. All right. Any questions about a graph like this? Sweet. One of the things that I want to talk about is what happens when you have a agonist and a partial agonist in talking about affinity. So if we take a look at two drugs like heroin and buprenorphine, which is the opiate component of Suboxone, if we look at the affinities of these drugs, these are made up, but we could say that heroin has an affinity of maybe 10 kilomolar, while buprenorphine has an affinity of 10 nanomolar. So who has higher affinity? Buprenorphine. Yeah. If we look at the Emax, heroin has an Emax of 100%, and buprenorphine has an Emax of 60%. So why do we give buprenorphine to people who might use opiates? What would happen if you gave buprenorphine to someone who is using heroin?
Because it's still it has a greater affinity, so it's going to bind to the receptors first, but it's not going to give that like full effect like heroin would.
Exactly. So just like what Kaylee said is that it has a higher affinity, so it will bind first and tighter, and it will only give 60% of the response. So what's going to end up happening is you have your opiate receptor, and someone is actively using heroin. You add buprenorphine into their body, and what's going to happen is that the buprenorphine is going to kick out the heroin. If we look at if we compare the activity or what the effect is here, will the activity of, let's say that this is a GS receptor, will after buprenorphine binds, will the concentration of CAMP go up or down? It goes down, right? Because it's not having a full effect, it's having a partial effect. Will the activity of GS go up or down? Down. It has 40% less activity. what this means is that buprenorphine, based on the Emax, is a partial agonist. Heroin is a full agonist. What we find is that, and this is the key concept, in the presence of a full agonist, a partial agonist can act like an antagonist. Why? Because the total activity of the receptor is going down. So is it an antagonist? Is it creating zero response? No. It's only when you have a full agonist and a partial agonist do you have this decreased response, and it looks like antagonism. Now, if you have someone who is using heroin and is used to using heroin, what happens if you give them buprenorphine? What's the real world effect of giving them buprenorphine? Yeah, so in terms of getting a high, are they going to get high off of the buprenorphine? No. Now, what happens if you give someone heroin and you give them naloxone, which is an antagonist?
Naloxone cancels out the effect of it doesn't let them like feel the high.
Yeah, so zero response, right? So no high. So you give them buprenorphine, teeny little high. Give them naloxone, nothing. You're getting nothing. How about in terms of withdrawal? Which one is going to cause withdrawal, buprenorphine or naloxone?
Naloxone.
Both of them. Why? Because they're both acting as antagonists. They're both blocking the full effect. Even though buprenorphine's only blocking partial, it's still lowering the activity. And if you have someone who's using a substance for a long time, their body gets used to that level of activity. And if you suddenly decrease it, you induce withdrawal. So this is a real world example of why you cannot give someone who's addicted to opiates, you can't start them on Suboxone right away, because otherwise you're going to put them in withdrawal and then they're going to hate you and then they're going to leave therapy. They're going to leave the hospital.
That's why they have methadone clinics, right?
Yes. Yeah. So methadone is an option for people who, if they don't want to use Suboxone, that they can use methadone. Although you can give Suboxone, but you have to wait so many hours after they last used. So essentially, you have to wait until they're already in withdrawal to give Suboxone. Any questions about affinity and potency? All right. Last thing that we are going to talk about with PCOL is looking at selectivity. So once again, we're looking at the KD. And what we are looking at here is when we give a drug, we're looking for it to bind to the receptor of interest. So if you have a selective drug, it should have high affinity for the receptor of interest and low affinity for all other receptors. Right? If I give a drug, I don't want it to go everywhere. I want it to go to the one place I want it. So if we compare these two different drugs, what we can see is that for drug 1, does it have a higher affinity for our target or for other receptors or proteins? For the target, right? This is a lower number, so it is has a higher affinity for it. What about for drug 2? Is it higher affinity for our target or for other? Once again, for our target. Which has higher affinity for our target, drug 1 or drug 2? Neither. They have the same affinity, right? They're both 1 nanomolar. Looking at just these two numbers here, you'd say, which one is the better option for preventing side effects? 2, right? No. It would be 1, right? Because we want it to have low affinity for other proteins. So this means that it will not bind. This has high affinity for other proteins, meaning it will bind. So which one is the preferred drug in this instance? Drug 1, because it is high affinity for the receptor of interest and low affinity for other receptors or proteins or whatever the target is. The interesting thing is that we have to look at what the how concentration changes selectivity, because not every drug maintains the same selectivity at different concentrations in the body. So when we look at the blood level of the drug, which is what this is, which can be really abstracted and say this is almost the same thing as saying the dose. So as the dose increases, what we see is that we get really good selectivity for our target and about 20% selectivity for other proteins. For drug 2, at the same doses, we have really, really good selectivity of our target, but we have broad non-selectivity for everything else. So which drug is probably going to have less side effects? Drug 1. So what's important to understand here? The best drugs are those that have high affinity for the target, low for everything else, and maintain that at high doses. It doesn't matter if you have 99% affinity if you have 99% affinity for everything else. Then you are useless. Can we tell anything about potency here? No, because potency refers to dose. These are the same dose. 1 nanomolar, 100 nanomolar. If I gave you, okay, I guess that's just there from now on. If I gave you drug 3, And I said that we had 1 nanomolar, 50 nanomolar. So we had 50% and 0.1%, 99%, and 30. No, we'll make it 15%. Now, can we talk about potency? Yes, because now we have differences in doses. So potency is dose. Selectivity is target versus non-target. Affinity is how tightly you bind with the receptor. And the last thing, efficacy, is the response. Can we tell efficacy based off of these tables? Nope. We have no data. Maybe you bind tightly, but you have 20% activation. We don't know. All we know is that you bind. We don't know what kind of response you have. Any questions about this? Okay. Is this helpful? Kind of, sort of. This is, I think, new stuff for you guys. You'll probably get to it in next class. We got through about half of the PCOL PowerPoint, so which is great. We'll probably finish the next one. We'll probably finish PCOL on Wednesday, and then or do you guys want to do MedChem on Wednesday? Because next week you have PCOL exam. Let's do PCOL on Wednesday. We'll do MedChem on Monday, and then PCOL again on Wednesday. And then we'll do that. Okay. We're only going to need 1 session to go through MedChem. I'm going to... Chemistry is my thing. You know that. All right. Sweet. As soon as this uploads to Zoom, I will upload it